Uh, Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's really lovely to have all of you here. My name is Habib, and I am the Vice Chancellor of SOAS. I really do want to apologize. I want to start off with an apology. And really, I'm going to apologize because as soon as I have welcomed you, in about 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to have to leave. And really, I don't want you to think of this as a discourtesy. It's really not meant as a discourtesy. I do have to be across town to meet a few donors for SOAS. And I do want to say that is the nature of life of universities in the UK these days, where we are so dependent on having to raise resources from multiple quarters. So my apologies for that. I am really sorry that that has been the case. It really is my pleasure to see all of you gathered here in celebration of Arabic literature, translation, and frankly, more than a quarter of a century's partnership with the Banipal Trust for Arab Literature and SOAS. We take pride, SOAS, in the global role we meant to play in enabling conversation. Nanda, Wen-chin and others have heard me say this so much that they often try and fall asleep as I have to say it. But really, our new strategic agenda is to build bridges. SOAS has got it in its mission. But our big agenda in the contemporary era is to recognize that all of our challenges in our world is transnational in character. Whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change, whether it's social and political polarization, and dare I say cultural polarization in our world. And if we're going to be able to address those challenges, we need the ability to get both global science and technology, global research, but also local understanding. How often we remember we had, in the middle of COVID, we had this vaccine, same vaccine, but if you applied it to Tokyo or to New York, it had fundamentally different consequences. Because culture matters. History and architecture and politics and the social life of a people matters. And so, in a sense, at the very heart of our plan is to build these equitable partnerships between institutions in what I call the majoritarian world and institutions in the UK, in part to enable this idea that we're going to train the world's people. And by bringing them here is a long past agenda. We actually need to work with institutions around the world in intricate conversations. So we bring the global and the local in conversation with each other. We create a much better learning enterprise, a much better research enterprise. And how we do that in a world of such dramatic inequalities is the real art of our time. It's how do we begin to think and act equitably in an unequal world. And that's what we've taken at the very heart of our strategic agenda. And so, when the Center for Translation Studies and the Center for Cultural, Literary, and Postcolonial Studies enable these kind of dialogues about the immediate relevance of the humanities and the translation to intercultural understanding, they fundamentally speak to the heart of our strategic plan. They speak to not only our strategic plan, to the challenge of our times. This evening, we celebrate 2 authors, Khalid Boutawa and Najwa Barakat, both from war-torn countries, both Libya and Lebanon in many ways. And both, our celebration of them today is a recognition of how much work we have to do. Both are located in a part of the world that is torn asunder. At a moment when we, as a human community, have to cohere to address the challenges of our time. We are, as a human community, more divided than ever. Divided in the Middle East, hugely. We've got thousands of people that have died, 12,000 children that have been killed at the dawn of the 21st century is a tragedy of our times. But that's not a problem only of the Middle East. If you simply look at Europe and what's happened in the Netherlands and the rise of the far right in Germany and in Italy and potentially in France, what's playing out in North America, we are a world that is really in trouble. There is a moment of urgent need for intercultural understanding. And when we celebrate colleagues from a part of the world that is in crisis, we celebrate them because we use them as symbols for effectively the world we want to build. A world we want to enable into being. And hopefully a higher education system that recognizes we've got to bring the majoritarian world and what has come to be known as the West in conversation with each other so that we enrich each other in our understandings, in our research, in our scientific technologies. So I tend to talk too much at this point, so I'm going to shut up at this point. Forgive me for this. But it is particularly an important moment. And again, I hope that you have a wonderful celebration. I hope that you have a wonderful intellectual conversation. And my apologies for having to leave you at this point. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to be playing musical chairs all evening. I'm Paul Starkey, the chair of the Banipal Trust for Arab Literature, and I'd like to add my own welcome to that of Adam Habib that we've just heard, both to people that are in the hall and to those of you that are watching us on Zoom. It's very good to have this link with SOAS, and let's hope it will continue and flourish. Just a very few words about the Trust, which I'll keep brief, as most of you will already be familiar with the Trust's activities. The name Banipal will probably be most familiar to many of you in conjunction with the word magazine, Banipal magazine, which sadly has now closed, at least in its English version. After publishing a numberless selection of translations into English of Arabic and Arab writing, poetry, short stories, extracts from modern novels since 1998. The Trust, the Banipal Trust, and members of the Trust worked closely with the magazine when the magazine was being published. And the Trust itself has been organising an annual translation prize in conjunction with the Society of Authors for the translation of a work of modern Arabic literature into English since 2006. The prize, the Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize for Arabic Literary Translation, is funded through the generosity of the Ghobash family, to whom we remain most grateful. More recently, an annual lecture has been added to the Trust's activities, and tonight we're engaging in something of an experiment, combining the two activities in a single evening for the first time. So not only do we have here to welcome this year's lecturer, Khalid Mutawa, but also the winner of this year's translation prize, Luke Leifgren, and this year's chair of judges, Ros Schwartz, who will be in conversation during the second half of the proceedings, which will also include some readings from the winning translation. We also have another judge this year's panel, Sarah Inani, is also in the audience. So welcome to all of them. On one level, one does, of course, feel slightly uncomfortable hosting an event like this at the present time, as we're all conscious of the horrendous events unfolding in Gaza, the West Bank and Israel, and particularly since we are meeting in the world's university, as SOAS likes to call it, the effective destruction of the higher education sector in Gaza. In this connection, I'd like to commend to you the excellent letter addressed to the Prime Minister and to relevant Secretaries of State by the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, which you can find on their website. However, it is just these sort of situations, perhaps, that make translation arguably become of more rather than less importance. You can bomb mosques, hospitals and schools, but you cannot arguably bomb words, at least in not quite the same sort of way. And it's against that background that we start this evening's proceedings with the annual Banipal lecture, which this year, as I've already mentioned, is being combined for the first time with a celebration of the prize winner. And it's a great pleasure to introduce the Libyan-American poet and translator, Khalid Mutawa, who is himself the author of 6 books of his own poetry and has translated 12 more volumes of modern Arabic poetry into English. He also has a more intimate connection with Banipal. His translation of Adoni's selected poems won the 2011 Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize for Arabic Literary Translation. And in addition to a lot of other awards and so forth, his translation of Saadi Yusuf's selected poems Without an Alphabet, Without a Face won the PEN Award for Poetry in Translation in 2003. And in addition to having won the Banipal Prize, he has been a founding contributing editor of Banipal magazine, now sadly closed. The title of Khalid's lecture today is Stations of Translation, Power, Eros and Betrayal. Or some people say Eros. I looked it up and on websites it suggested there were 21 ways you could pronounce this word. Take your pick. It promises at any rate to be a fascinating task, which starts from the premise that translation is as old as human speech itself. And Khalid's presentation will explore the dynamics of translation as Eros, and I quote from his abstract. The lecture will examine the dynamics of translation Eros from a post-colonial perspective, with a special focus on Arabic literature in the light of the transformative events taking place currently in Gaza. So over to you, Khalid.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I would like to begin by thanking the Banipal Trust for Arabic Literature for the honor of this invitation. I so deeply appreciate what they have accomplished and the inviting light of empathy and understanding they continue to offer us in the many dark days of the past few decades since their inception. I was invited into the Banipal family in its very early stages, and I'm delighted to see how we've grown together. As a winner and finalist for the prize, I'm also want to express my heartfelt congratulations to Luke and to Najwa for the prize. Thank you also to Professor Habib for providing context, and he's not with us, but I wish him good luck with the donors. Also to the Center for Translation Studies, the Center for Cultural Languages and Postcolonial Studies as well for hosting us today. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I appreciate this opportunity to meditate with you on a part of my practice that for 35 years has run parallel to my own writing and has fed my imagination and informed my work in unstated, deeply penetrative ways. a practice that has supplemented my calling with purpose, provided it immense joys, along with eloquent and highly poetic company. So thank you again. For many reasons, I always struggle with these presentations. I saw my dear friend Hisham Matar, and I told him I have a 40-minute presentation. And he said, why don't you make it 30 and enjoy it and let others enjoy it as well? I'm sorry, we're going to have to suffer through this together. So it is in the projected neighborhood of 40 minutes, and I will just lean forward a little bit. So stations in translation, of course, the reference to the stations of the cross, in the sense that there are things that we're going to run into. My first idea was also call it mawaqif, as a reference to the that concept in Sufi literature. Stations in translation: power, eros, and betrayal. I should begin by amending the title of this talk slightly to Stations of in Translation, Power, Eros, and Betrayal after Gaza. And so as I speak of translation, I will likely vacillate between three forms of translation: interlingual, between languages; intercultural, between cultures; and intersubjective, the translation of self into another. While translation has always been about trying to communicate with or understand the other who speaks a different language, interest in translation has ebbed and flowed. In more recent times, one of the great engines of translation is a philosophical change, perhaps in mankind's view of itself, mainly the claims of the Enlightenment for the equality of mankind, the resultant obligatory rights that ought to be granted to each individual to assure this equality. In the modern era, we've had two ages of enlightenment, one beginning the 18th century and a second established at the end of the World War II. Both enlightenments were characterized by claims for the equality of mankind, which led to greater interest in translation as a mechanism for intercultural knowledge exchange and created a space for interlinguistic, erotic, and cultural kinship. But both currents and the states and institutions that represented these values have been unable to resist the power differential between the cultures and societies engaged in this exchange, whereby Europe, North America, Euro-America have constantly made exceptions to their stated values to justify injustice and violence. The fact that Enlightenment values have been betrayed does not mean that translation is not a powerful source of connection and innovation. Translation is a facility we acquired so that we may be engaged in an eternal process of knowing each other as we change and evolve. Life depends on newer versions of things immersion and newer versions of ourselves that bear our sameness and the traces of another life in it, and hence the analogy of linguistic exchange and reproduction, translation, and eros. Eros, we may recall, and the 21 definitions of eros, the word itself is a kind of Kama Sutra of pronunciations. Eros, we may recall, is a Greek god who is a child of Aphrodite, goddess of sexual love and beauty, who was fathered by Zeus, or Ares, or Hermes, messenger of the gods. While all traces of the various fathers can be attributed to Eros, Eros was assigned to be the god of fertility as well as passion. Eros, we should note, was given a brother, Anteros, the god of mutual love, who we'll come back to later. Like Eros, translation has the power to break us away from the solitude of solipsism and the myopia of narcissism, with empathy and affection, and the expansion of the self. It's a process of community making, of fecundity and fertility to ward off ignorance and isolation. The great translation theorist George Steiner tells us that the first stage of translation is initiative trust, an investment in the meaningfulness and seriousness of an adverse text. This is a psychologically hazardous state that leaves the translator epistemologically exposed. The philosophical bedrock of this initiative trust is a belief in the coherence of the world, in the presence of meaning in very different, perhaps formally antithetical semantic systems, as well as in the validity of analogy and parallel in human interaction. These are the same forces that give rise to the stated values of both epochs of enlightenment. Steiner affirms that eros and language mesh at every point. Intercourse and discourse, copula and copulation are subclasses of the dominant fact of communication. They arise from the life need of the ego to reach out and comprehend another human being, he explains. Eros and language translation construe the grammar of being. After the translator brings the translated text home at Steiner, we proceed to incorporation, where we accommodate the new text in the new home to widen one's grammar and vocabulary. Then finally, we reach reciprocity, where the translation is supposed to body forth its object. What we're talking about then is a manifold relationship where fidelity, like identity, is being created. To be true to another text is not to be an echo to Narcissus, but to be curious and initiate curiosity. As such, there is no richer trail of inquiry than translation, a process that guides us towards the great longing for the completion of language. To use Walter Benjamin's words. In translation's various phases, we experience longing and its fulfillment being undone by each other, mediated encounters with the ineffable that encapsulate what we live for, and real evidence in the translated text that the broken languages of others can find a home within us, a process where longing becomes belonging. Like eros, translation is more than its function. In fact, translation fails when it limits itself to the conveyance of information, because information is the least essential aspect of a literary work, states the late Dennis Potter. Walter Benjamin posits a kinship among all natural languages, an ahistorical and pervasive expressive intentionality that exists in the world's languages, a capacity that can never be realized in any one language by itself. As a result, all languages embody a more or less hidden, yet nonetheless urgent aspiration to achieve the conditions of what he calls pure language. In the same way that erotic union overcomes the physical and points to transcendence, as mystical poets from Mirabai to St. John of the Cross to the Sufi poets have contended. The translator releases his own language into or toward pure language, which is under the spell of another. The purity is not in the outcome, but in the barzakh, the in-betweenness, or in the ecstatic state of fana, of being neither in the original or the recipient, which is the bonus or excess that neither of them, neither language, can garner on its own. Proof that eros, or rather translation, is the god of literary fecundity and invention can be found everywhere. In ancient China, ancient Greece, and Rome, interlingual and intercultural exchanges exercised through the erotics of translation were the engines of literary and philosophical invention. When it comes to Arabia and the emergence of Islam, we often think of Mecca as the locus of a pure Arabic language, but Mecca must have been a multilingual space in its trade routes to Sham and Yemen, bringing with them speakers or traces of Aramaic and Sabian. We also think of Arabic as a language of isolated nomads, but why is the simile of foreigners babbling in Greek a common trope in Jahili poetry? To me, the genius of Arabic Islamic civilization when it was vigorous was its ability to hitch up its cultural tent toward new linguistic pastors, and its atrophying for me is associated with its loss of linguistic diversity. coming to Europe now? Can we think of Protestantism existing without the German translation of the Bible by Martin Luther, nonetheless? Or the English Protestant movements without William Tyndale's and Miles Coverdale's English translations of the Bible, 100 years or so before the official King James Bible? Closer to our time, modern poetry is the child of cross-Atlantic bilingualism. Poe to Baudelaire via translation, to Pound and Eliot, adding the mix of the Provençal poets. Or perhaps it's the child of European and Asian, European and Asian poetry, a child of many fathers like Eros. For wood, the page missing maybe. Where would Pound be, who was the sort of chief engineer of much of modern poetry, without having met Tagore and Levi, who gave him his Cathay? So the seeds of translation as a progenitor or as the father of invention in literature is all over. All these moments and adjustments in the culture, or to the culture of the other, caused by linguistic melding between peoples by the discovery and practice of intellectual and physical kinship, and necessary to any renaissance of translation, was always an arousal of the notion of oneness and a shared fate between the self and one's culture with that of the other. In Islam, the Quran has no Tower of Babel, but tells us that God had meant for humanity to be made up of peoples and tribes so that they may engage in ongoing process of knowing. لِتَعَارَفُوا. Another clearly stated notion is that of being no difference between the Arabi and Ajami, except in their degrees of taqwa, which is more than fear of God, but all the ethics and discipline a virtual life requires, such as balance between body and soul, possession of an inner life, and dedication for the truth. These principles allowed non-native speakers of Arabic to join and lead Islamic civilization's pursuit of knowledge, making the lands of Arabic and Islam one of the great engines of translation. And since the beginning of the European Enlightenment, with its ideas of the equality of mankind, liberty, progress, and fraternity, that call for society to be based upon reason and its individuals judged by their character and deeds rather than race or origin or faith, all the way to the United Nations and the push for multilingual and multi-ethnic democracies, we have been sailing a great ship powered by engines of translation. The 18th century is widely known as a republic of letters led by erudite multilinguals who together shaped our ideas of democracy. Multilingualism remains integral to democracy now. In my very state of Michigan, my fellow citizens can vote in Arabic, Bangla, Burmese, English, Hindi, Korean, Mandarin, Tagalog, and Urdu. This excitement about the knowledge to be gained from translation was not missed on one of the great chroniclers of early 19th century England. I'm speaking of Middlemarch, George Eliot's great novel. In Middlemarch, we meet the scholar Edward Casaubon. I know people hit on him all the time. He's the cause of all evil. The middle-aged husband of the novel's young protagonist, Dorothea. Casaubon, as you'll remember, is working on a book titled The Key to All Mythologies. He's making no headway, and he cannot read German, where the new ideas in his field are quickly developing. Casaubon's intellectual impotence is reflected in his complete disinterest in having a physical relationship with his young bride. His linguistic isolation from the vitality occurring in his field of research is represented by his inability to consummate his relationship with Dorothea. Casaubon's infertility is juxtaposed with the vitality of his Polish-named cousin, Will Ladislaw, who is fluent in German and resides in Rome. A person living in translation, Will, while uncertain about his future, is forward-looking, engaged, and passionate, and is competing with Casaubon for Dorothea's affection. Eliot's message is clear, if I may put it bluntly. Intellectual vitality arises from a world where ideas are exchanged in translation. Despite the uncertainties, monolingualism is a path to frailty, bitterness, and death, which was Casaubon's fate in the novel. Translation is joy, vitality, and fecundity indeed. Now to betrayal. Like me, you've also heard the expression translation is betrayal. It's a cliched notion that apprentice journalists have tossed at me. An accusation I've heard in my classes sometimes when certain lines or weaker passages of translated poems suggest that there is something lost in translation due to the translator's inability to be faithful somehow. Such statements nearly always incense me and invoke a sense of loyalty to other translators and to the necessary work they do for every language. I remind my interlocutors that translation is a gain, not a loss, because without it, there is a great deal that we would not have known, and that our general knowledge and our languages themselves are enriched by what is translated into them. But the notion that betrayal somehow shadows translation is not limited to the unenlightened monolingual journalists or underclassmen. According to Roman Jakobson, translators betray a text when they disarticulate the original, and for Paul Domain, when they reveal that the original was always disarticulated. Domain suggests that betrayal arises from the unavoidable resistance of linguistic forms to human meanings. He asserts that translation disrupts the original unintentionally, making the reader aware of certain disjunctions, certain accommodations, certain weaknesses, certain cheatings, certain conventions, certain characteristics which don't correspond to the claim of the original, so that the original loses its sacred character. There is no one to blame, if you will, in this, but the destabilizations these actions cause render translation impossible. But even when it's done well, could translation still be a betrayal? This thought, assuming that I do it well, this thought occurred to me a few years ago while reading a passage that Benjamin quotes from Randolph Penwitz, who states that the translator must expand and deepen his language by means of the foreign language. The verbs expand and deepen, and the duty of the translator to gift them to his language, which used to make me so optimistic in the past, gave me pause with realization. Until then, I had translated solely from Arabic to English and devoted much of my time working ostensibly to expand English, my stepmother tongue, while doing nothing for my mother tongue, Arabic. This guiltful thought reminded me of an American critic who, intending praise, called me, among other immigrant poets, linguistic turncoats, which somehow stings in retrospect. Was I betraying Arabic by not expanding and deepening it? And what am I helping English transcend by incorporating Arabic poetry in it? The original expression that translation is betrayal comes to us from the Italian traditori. Someone maybe correct my Italian, but I'm going to mispronounce it continuously. Its coiner unknown, but it's almost certainly the result of wordplay. The homophonic proximity of traduttori to traditori is what made this saying stick, but also because the expression has a ring of truth in it. Translation can betray when it offers knowledge that empowers someone else. As author C. Danto explains, if I give away my knowledge, I lose power if others can use that knowledge I possess for their own purposes, and these thwart mine. He encounters, why should I tell you the truth? If you know what I know, my power is dissipated. Columbus complained a lot about translators not telling him the truth. Why should they? This immediate distrust comes from those who are powerless. So, or nearly so. Danto suggests A secret language gives power only so long as it is secret, and I betray the secret when I translate, putting the knowledge and the power in alien hands, he adds. Indeed, while God may have cursed humanity by splintering our one language into many in the Tower of Babel, it's possible that we actually needed to create new languages. We needed new languages or codes in order to tell secrets and to exclude those whom we fear. A breaker of codes, translation can have the sapping effect on those who need to keep secrets to survive. This last point brings to mind the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and before that from Iraq and even Vietnam. As the Taliban seized Kabul, and as Americans' armed forces and other Western organizations were leaving Afghanistan, one began to hear on the radio and in the news a great deal about the Afghani translators. Before Afghanistan, the US did the same in Iraq, and you may still be doing the same in Iraq. And you may recall the Vietnamese who stood on the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon in 1975. Many of them were translators, maybe not literary translators, but translators. Reading and listening to those stories about rescuing translators, I was intrigued by how persistently the translators are considered traitors in these enemy nations, and how sympathetically they are promoted in Western media as benign, innocent figures. Is translating for an invading army an innocent activity? The late, great Iraqi poet Saad Youssef accused some of his fellow communist Iraqi literati who worked with American forces of being translators who graduated from torture chambers. Clearly, among many in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam before them, there is a sense that translators offered the invading armies certain knowledge that added to their power and weakened them. This could be by offering new information that the invader did not know, but also confirming false information that the invader knows. Whatever the case may be, translation is consequential. I know I've taken us far away from the peaceful world of literary translation, but even in our practice, what makes translation give up its life force of fertility that Steiner describes and its capacity for kinship that Benjamin foresees are differentiations of power, and the gradations of power between the European and Euro-American and the non-Euro-American are immense. So now to power. Now that we are talking about power, a quick historical contextualization is necessary, and yes, going back to the primary encounter between modern Europe and the Near East, that old horse of historical explanations, the Napoleonic expedition. I'll make it short. When, along with a conquering army, Napoleon brought with him the two main principles of the Enlightenment, the equality of mankind and a commitment to scientific truth. Scholar Taj al-Din, whom I'll be leaning on heavily here, argues that unlike the generally acknowledged polarities of domination and resistance that we associate with colonialism and Orientalism, translation in this case offered a space where Arab intellectuals came to love and to be seduced by Europe. On the face of it, Europe seemed keen to be true to its Enlightenment values. However, she states three areas, condensing them. One, colonial Europe, via its Oriental discourse, appeared to affirm Egypt's Pharaonic and Arab Islamic past as unbroken, still vital, and uncolonized. European colonialism appeared to validate the Arab Islamic culture, even as it denigrated it, putting Egypt and Egyptians on an illusory footing of equal exchange. This equal footing of exchange is being offered to us now and remains illusory. Two, the colonizers' early use of Arabic language played its part in nativizing the dominator. In 1789, Napoleon, we remember, circulated a proclamation in Arabic mimicking Quranic style that assured the predominantly Muslim people of Egypt that the French were sincere Muslims like them. More than a century later, the Italians in my native Libya took a similar approach, culminating in Mussolini's pilgrimage to the fourth shore, that's Libya, and raising the sword of Islam. This nativizing of the dominator is still occurring in different guises. 3. Colonial powers also offered the allure of kinship. Tajuddin cites how in India, British Orientalism invented linguistic and ethnological family trees that trace Sanskrit and English to a common Indo-European source and constructed Aryan affinities between Indians and Englishmen, a kinship that was later denied once Britain held sway in India. Similar approaches were offered to Arabic and Islamic civilizations that were countries that were colonized. The allure of kinship is part of the exchange between Europe and America and is continuously elusive now. You might say that that was long ago. Napoleon, Mussolini, not now, not us. Let me propose then Saadi Yusuf's poem, America, America. Please note that Saadi is the translator of Walt Whitman, the great American poet of democracy, in which he outlines these dynamics. So Saadi writes, God save America, my home sweet home. I too love jazz and jeans and Treasure Island and John Silver's Parrot and the balconies of New Orleans. I love Mark Twain and the Mississippi steamboats and Abraham Lincoln's dogs. I love the fields of wheat and corn and the smell of Virginia tobacco. But I'm not American. Is that enough for the phantom pilot to turn me back to the Stone Age? As you will note, for the first couplet that I read, Saadi mistakenly, but maybe appropriately, conflates Britain's God Save the Queen with America's God Bless America, as most American presidents close their speeches. Saadi replaces bless with save, as in the British God Save the Queen or King, as the case may be. Then, of course, the American homily, My Home, Sweet Home. The passage is a list of what has been seductive about America, mostly 19th century references or images that have traces of slavery in them, but also allude to music, beautiful architecture, and emancipation. Loving these things about America, however, does not prevent the American pilot from wanting to turn the poet's home country to the Stone Age. The phrase, to turn something to the Stone Age, is something that American generals have used to threaten adversaries such as Vietnam, and even allies such as Pakistan, and of course that was the idea about Hiroshima. It does not pay to love America and the West's cultural gifts because the threat of annihilation remains. Later in the poem, Saadi, using the ritual of gift exchange, maybe a play on the gift exchange between the civilized and the savage, attempts to negotiate with America. It's important to note that Saadi's poem was written in the mid-1990s when the Clinton administration was considering bombing Iraq again, around the same time when the US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stated that the death of nearly 500,000 Iraqis due to Western sanctions was worth it. Here's what Saadi offers. America, let's exchange gifts. Take your smuggled cigarettes and give us potatoes. Take James Bond's golden pistol and give us Marilyn Monroe's giggle. Take the heroin syringe under the tree and give us vaccines. Take your blueprints of model penitentiaries and give us village homes. Take the books of your missionaries and give us paper for poems to defame you, like the beat poets. Take what you do not have and give us what we have. Take the stripes of your flag and give us the stars. Take the Afghani Mujahideen beard and give us Walt Whitman's beard filled with butterflies. Take Saddam Hussein and give us Abraham Lincoln, or give us no one. America has brought smuggling, guns, spies with golden pistols that the British touch, increased drug trafficking, missionaries, and Islamic radicalism. These were not what was promised in the seduction of the region, with Marilyn Monroe's giggle a prominent feature of the American allure, the soulful melodies of jazz music of the descendants of feared slaves, and the fatherly beard of Walt Whitman brimming with butterflies, as Federico Garcia Lorca had described it, whom Saadi also translated, with reference to Saddam Hussein and Abraham Lincoln, with the reference to Saddam Hussein and Abraham Lincoln. Again, the poem was written before the Second War of Iraq. Saadi suggested that the oncoming engagement with the region should bring either emancipation or should not take place at all. My question to us as translators, as part of the economy of cultural gift exchange, is in what way is our work playing a part in this equilibrium? Is it part of an emancipatory effort, or something not clearly defined, lost in the shuffle of political priorities? Where are we? Where does our work stand? Indeed, the Arab literati of the 19th through 20th century bought into this erotic validation that had been established now for 2 centuries, and seemingly mutual attraction with Euro-America. For while they decried the military, economic, and political violence, this is Tajuddin speaking, that European imperialism wreaked on their land, they, nonetheless, imagined their relationship to Western aesthetics and epistemologies in terms of love, not subjection. Indeed, the world as it was set up in the rules-based order after World War II, starting from the UN, itself a beehive of translation, relations between the peoples of the world, the books and ideas they offered, were expected to receive validation, to stand on equal footing in a process of exchange, to engage us in reciprocity and kinship that binds all peoples. For in both eras, while all this interlinguistic eros was taking place, Europe, America perpetually made wide exceptions for its Enlightenment values. And this is what we are witnessing in Gaza. Indeed, things may have changed, but the principles of granting the European American the right to commit violence on others remains the primary force impacting our region and the world and our cultural exchanges. The list of these exceptions, by the way, is really very long and runs from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia to Baghdad being burning like a Christmas tree. This exceptionalism has translated itself into what Fanon has called compartmentalization, where non-Euro-American cultural products are segregated in how they're received and perceived in the global market of ideas. Here are the accommodations that have been made for us. We are, of course, emblems of the past. When it comes to non-European cultural products, translated or otherwise, these products and their artists are seen as coming from the past, for only the future belongs to Europe and America. These works of art have to compete for their place in the fundamentally unequal ground of Western temporality. This plays into the European celebration of the colonized people's past glory and past contributions to civilization. And that's exactly how Tagore, Gibran, and the ancient Egyptian mummies were welcomed into the Western world. Our literature is often presented as something already seen, snippets from antiquated ways of living that had little bearing on the big world, the industrial technological world. This designation of the non-European as an obstacle for the past, from the past, impeding the march of progress, is still with us today. And until recently, here's how the New York Times blowhard Thomas Friedman, telling it like it is, 2 weeks ago wrote, "On the one side is the resistance network, dedicated to preserving closed autocratic systems where the past buries the future," and that's what's important. On the other side is the inclusion network, trying to forge more open, connected, pluralizing systems where the future buries the past. As I speak to you, of course, the inclusion network is wholeheartedly supporting a war on nearly 2 million Gazans who are being shelled and buried under the rubble, starved, deprived of medical care, and living out in the open. It's the inclusion network. We are victims of the past and need rescue. Despite the fact that the rules-based order spearheaded by the United States has led to the creation of more war victims and refugees in the world, the other recognizable platform for artistic or literary production offered to us is that of artists are victims of that non-European past, or what Friedman called the resistance network. The requirement here is that the victim must seek shelter in the West. Artists who engage their cultures on sensitive matters but do not seek Western approval or rescue are either insufficiently victimized or are not liberated or future-oriented enough. Whether we like it or not, this crude formula has impacted what we translate and how, and definitely what gets published and how it's framed and presented. Gayatri Spivak warns that against translated text from the colonized world, where the translator is being attentive only to the anthropological information it can derive about the presumed plight of the non-Western or non-white female subject. In this already set context, the translator is not asked to bring something new, but to feed an established narrative with new raw material. The other accommodation, of course, is to work from the inside, our current positionality. For us who are endeavoring to undermine the negative views entrenched in about the non-European, our effort has focused on trying to humanize them in the eyes of the West. The word humanize is one of the worst verbs that I use to describe my work, to humanize. Humanize them in the eyes of the West. Indeed, my first impulse to translate had emerged from the Steinerian reproductive encounter with Arabic poems that flashed with powerful rays of Benjamin's pure language as I rendered them into English. The aim was to render these non-European texts and their cultures into an empowered equivalence with those of their dominators and thereby repress the inequalities between those dominators and themselves, to use Said's words. Said calls this process the voyage in, a conscious effort to enter into the discourse of the West, to mix with it, transform it. Writing about the 19th century, for the main part, Tajuddin tells us that this has happened before with our progenitor translators to Arabic, putting a predictable damper on their efforts and perhaps on ours. She reminds us that cultural imperialism might be better understood as a politics that lures the colonized to seek power through empire rather than against it, to translate their cultures into an empowered equivalence with those of their dominators and thereby repress the inequalities between them. She goes on to call this effort a process of translational seduction, a diverting of energies through the subtle manipulation of illusion. So, is that where we are? Are we engaged in an invigorating, humanizing, reciprocating eros of minds through translation? Or are we seduced by the illusion of reciprocity and recognition? Whether we agree with Tajuddin's view or whether it applies to our situation or not, it's clear to me, at least among the diasporics who have also chosen to work on the inside, that we've had conversations similar to those between the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz and his friend, the Indian philosopher Raja Rao in 1969. Addressing Rao, Miłosz writes, "I learned at last to say, this is my home, here in a great republic, moderately corrupt." And so, many of us have accepted this corruption, the oblivion filling our chests, and the consenting silence presiding over our interaction with others, even before the flames had died, to quote Miłosz. This too will pass, we thought, and we'll go on doing God's work, writing, translating, lecturing, teaching, explaining to whoever will listen. I think what we can say about Gaza is that something new has happened. As our sister Arundhati Roy recently stated, the moral architecture of Western liberalism is disappearing before our eyes. It was always hypocritical, but even that provided some sort of shelter, a position half-heartedly claimed, unevenly practiced by powerful nations, and their institutions, but that allowed those invested in Enlightenment values to pursue them in earnest, even with limited outcomes. No more. Gone is any pretense of post-colonialism, multiculturalism, international law, the Geneva Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, gone is any pretense of free speech or public morality, states Ouyang. We really can't go back to these conversations with powerful entities in Euro-America and keep a straight face. The hypocrisy and the imposition of silence on those who are calling, those who are pursuing our calling, are having a chilling effect. How do we now go back to translating to the translations that we're working in, as we've done in the past, in the face of their neglect of the humanistic values we share, in their selectivity on which humans are worth saving and others whose death we tacitly accept, is my question. Things are changing. People have been utterly changed. The squares and streets of the free world, if you will, are thronging with supporters of Gaza survival for preserving the cherished values of equity and justice. They're calling on us to help make the change to uphold our institutions to their beliefs. Younger scholars, poets, and novelists are taking brave stances, endangering their own careers. As translators, and as the necessary link between languages and cultures, we need to practice the fidelity of our calling in its broadest sense. We listen, apprehend, interpret, and give voice. That's our habitual mode, our breathing evenly keeled on a horizon of justice. This gives us a moral authority that we should exercise now more than ever before. Let me close then by invoking Anteros, the son of Ares, the god of courage and Aphrodite, who was given as a companion to his brother Eros, who was lonely, and the notion that love must be requited if it is to prosper. The myth goes that Aphrodite complained to Themis, the goddess of justice and divine order, that Eros has remained a perpetual child. To this, Themis suggested that Aphrodite give Eros a brother. With Eros by his side, Eros grew and matured. But once Eros was away, Eros shrank back to his childhood. To prevent Eros from impulsively flinging arrows of affection and possibly arousing love, seduction, and betrayal and oppression, Anteros is there to urge Eros to act prudently. Not only so, Anteros is the consoler of those spurned by love, repairing the damage that his brother has caused. So in closing, I'll say, may we grow together and thrive in the siblinghood of translation, and may the force of Anteros be with us as we pursue our noble calling. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Khalid, for that immensely powerful and thought-provoking lecture. We now move on to the second part of the proceedings, and it's a great pleasure to introduce, first of all, Luke Leifgren, the winner of this year's Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize, for his translation of Mr. N by Najwa Barakat, which is published by And Other Stories. The prize itself was awarded yesterday evening at an event which some of you may have been at the British Library, organised by the Society of Authors. It's worth also mentioning that Luke is not a newcomer to this position. He's won the Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize before, in 2018, for his translation of Mohsin Ramli's The President's Gardens. I'd like to introduce also Ros Schwartz, the chief judge of the panel for this year's prize. she chaired the panel, and Ros is herself a distinguished and award-winning translator of distinction for her translations from French to English, which I'm told includes some translations of Francophone writers from North Africa, which is an area, of course, with which we are intimately concerned. She has incredibly, over 100 fiction and non-fiction titles to her name, and in addition to her own translations, she's been heavily involved in translator training. And we also have Sarah Inani, another of the judges, sitting there in the audience. So welcome to all of them. It's very nice to see you all here. Also on the stage is Samira Kawar, who has performed a similar function of this sort of gathering many times before, who I think is going to read some extracts in Arabic. And at a certain stage a little later, they'll be joined by Wen-chin Ouyang from SOAS, the institution that we're in at the moment. And there'll be a question and answer session, which Wen-chin will moderate. So with that, I will hand you over to our panelists on the stage, and in due course, then Wen-chin will join them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good evening, everybody, and good evening to everybody watching online. It's an enormous privilege to be here in conversation with Luke. And first of all, I'd like to just congratulate you on your amazing translation of this extremely complex and multi-layered book. Now, I know most of you might not have read it, so I'm going to ask Luke, first of all, just to talk about the book a little bit, and then Samira's going to read an extract in Arabic, and Luke's going to read an extract from the English.
Thank you so much, Ross and Paul and everyone with Banipal and SOAS and the Saif Ghobash Foundation. It's immensely gratifying to be here. It's a huge honor, and I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. So I was thinking this afternoon, how would I describe this book? And you would think I had done this plenty of times before, but I don't think it's still not easy to say what this book is about. It's quite complicated. There's a frame story. That's the easy part. The frame story is that a novelist has stopped writing and then 15 years later runs into one of his characters on the streets of Beirut. And not just any character, but a violent, murderous former militia person. And that then is the mystery, is how does this fictional character step foot into the streets of Beirut? And what does that mean for the author, who in fact kills off that character in the book 15 years ago? The book is about many other things. I think one of the themes is pain, both individual pain, stemming from a variety of sources, from families, from broken relationships, from other people, and a violent society. The book is about collective pain, the trauma that societies endure. And specifically, it's set in Beirut. So Beirut is an important part of this novel, almost a character in itself. And the history that has shaped modern Beirut, all the different peoples that have been coming there, some of the challenges, the dysfunction, the poverty, and then the author experiences some of this. And then there are various results as that come out of that. One other thing I would say about the novel is how intricate the narrative structure is. And so as you're reading, as I was reading, I often didn't know where I was. You would jump back and forth through time, back and forth through perspectives, often without much signposting. So after a section break, you find yourself in a different world, and it takes a little while to figure out what has happened. And so there's all these parallels that are going back and forth, and so that was one of the challenges. And one of the rewards of translating the book, as I read it and reread it and reread it, it gave me really a chance to deepen my knowledge and my understanding. Given that Beirut is almost a character in this novel, and given that Nejwa does such an amazing job of capturing the city, we'll start with an extract from one of the descriptions of Mr. N wandering through the city of Beirut. And Samira will start with the first section in Arabic.
عند منتصف الجسر قليل الارتفاع شعر بحريق في حلقه وبدموع تتجمع في مقلتيه. ثمة ما ارتطم بجسده فجأة فأوقف سيره وأشعره بدوار كمن اصطدم بجدار غير مرئي. شعر السيد نون بمعدته تصعد إلى فمه فضغط على أسنانه كي لا تخرج منه. كانت الرائحة نفاذة قوية كأنها القيامة، قاهرة صلدة بين القيء والحريق والاهتراء والبراز والعفن والصدأ، مجتمعة كلها ومركزة تتفاعل فيما بينها كلما هبت نسمة صاعدة هابطة متقدمة متراجعة كالموج. رفع السيد نون يديه يسد أنفه وقد شعر أن الرائحة الكريهة تهاجمه محاولة ولوجه. أمسك طرفي قميصه وتلثم ثم حث خطاه عله يعبر سريعا تلك الحدود.
Thank you so much, Samira.
Thank you.
And I will read some of that in English and go on just a little bit for a little bit extra of the English. By the time Mr. N reached the middle of the bridge, he felt a burning in his throat as the tears came. It was as though he'd crashed into some invisible wall, felt but not seen, bringing him to a halt, nauseating him, hemming him in. Mr. N gagged. He had to clench his teeth to keep his stomach from spilling out of his mouth. The odor descended like the Last Judgment, solid and forceful, a mix of vomit, burning, rot, excrement, mold, and rust, all collected and concentrated and perfectly balanced, rising and falling with every breeze, advancing and retreating like a wave. Mr. N tried to pinch his nose shut, but he could still feel the loathsome smell as it breached his defenses and slithered inside. Pulling up his collar, the collar of his shirt to cover his face, he hurried forward to cross the border. Yes, a border. For the line he crossed with only 2 steps might as well have separated 2 alien countries. Mar Mikhael and environs on the one side, Burj Hamud on the other. In the former were old houses of 2 or 3 stories, some with gardens, front gardens smelling of life. In the latter, Mr. N navigated high, dilapidated buildings, haphazardly placed, pushing against one another, tottering together, like man-made cumulus clouds locked in combat as they floated along with sense of decay from the slaughterhouses and the mountains of trash. These neighborhoods had begun as refugee camps for survivors of the Armenian massacres and the first Karantina fire. First came the tents, then the tents were transformed into tin shacks, then the tin became concrete. There were buildings that became houses, that became markets for various crafts. Armenia, Arax, Agabus, Sicilia, Camp Tared, Camp Amus, and Camp Maras. The jewelry market, the clothes market, the shoe and leather goods market, the food market, the vegetable market, and still others could now be found in the narrow lanes that branched off until they wound their ways to the homes of the poor who'd left their mountain villages for the outskirts of the capital, striving for their daily bread. The little streets boiled like a beehive with workers of 1,000 races and colors alongside refugees from all the wars of all the nations. Nepalese, Ethiopians, Sri Lankans, Filipinos, Egyptians, Sudanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds, Armenians, Syriacs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and, my God, Mr. N heard himself say, unable to control his eyes, which darted here and there like frenzied dogs.
Thank you. The descriptions in this book are just so powerful and so evocative, and you really managed to create that sense of place. I mean, the smells, the sounds, the sights, everything. Do you know Beirut, and do you think it's important for a translator to know the place they're describing?
I have visited Beirut, taken a bus there from Damascus on 2 occasions. I made friends with somebody named Hadi Maktabi. His family sells carpets in Beirut. I met him in Oxford, and when I was studying in Damascus, took the bus over to see him, and went up across the mountain and down, and then took a taxi through the city. I have not explored on foot, and not the neighborhoods that are described in this book. But I have some knowledge, some background, some of the places of Beirut. To the question of how valuable it can be for a translator to know a place, immensely valuable. And without having gone there, one film that I saw around the time, shortly before I translated this, was Capernaum, a Lebanese film set in Lebanon and amid immense poverty. And as I was reading this book, that's the movie that I was seeing. Those are the images. But yeah, so that's it was very helpful.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask you, how did this translation happen? Did you find the book, or did the book find you?
This book found me, and I would say, very lucky. I learned Arabic primarily in graduate school, and one of my teachers, Khaled al-Masri, who's now a professor at Swarthmore, introduced me to the first author I translated, Muhsina Ramli, and then also to the second author I translated, Najwa Barakat. And after I translated one book by each of them, they offered me the chance to translate further books by them. And so Najwa, who took a long break from writing, wrote this novel, and I think it was, again, Khaled. They had met up at some point, maybe at the Sharjah Book Festival or something else. They were traveling together, and she was excited to tell him about the book, and then he mentioned it to me, and then I was in touch with Najwa after that. And then she sent me a couple chapters, and I said I'd be very happy to translate it, and then she sent me the rest, and here we are.
But that's the author sending it to you. How did you find a publisher? I mean, did you have to do all the legwork?
So the first chapters came in the summer of 2018, and then the full manuscript, it was maybe January of 2019, and about a year later, I had a first draft that I sent to Najwa, and so this was early, January of 2020, and I was very excited about it. I was looking back, and I saw the email where I had written to her, and I told her that I thought this was my best work as a translator yet. So that was both fun to recapture that moment, and also humbling to think how much further the book came subsequent to that moment, with further editing and through the publication process. I didn't have a publisher lined up, and I think that's rather unusual for literary translators. It's a big risk to translate a full novel if you don't know that it's going to be published, or to find that kind of audience, or to be paid for. But it was something I was doing on the weekends alongside my full-time position as a university administrator. It was the following summer that I started sending it out to some publishers, and maybe a dozen or so, and one of them said it sounded interesting, but he was currently leaving that position. But then this is Jeremy Davies, an editor who was at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. A couple months later, he got back in touch after joining up with And Other Stories here in England. And he was excited that this might happen. And so we started a conversation, and then it was that fall that we signed the deal.
So that is a huge commitment and investment on your part to translate an entire novel on spec. I mean, you must have been really passionate about it.
I was. To be honest, I've done a number of novels on spec. I think the first 3 and several since then. And it's, as I mentioned, there are some risks in doing that, but translating is, for me, an immense pleasure. I learned Arabic in my 20s. It was very, very difficult, and the satisfaction that comes when when I did something that hard. Just reading Arabic is very satisfying. And then translating Arabic is a way that I continue learning. And it brings a sort of just immediate gratification in the way that a Sudoku puzzle does, or when I was younger playing video games would do. And so it's something that I do for recreation in a way, as well as feeling like there's a chance to build bridges or help authors reach an audience. And I think part of the challenge for me is that I'm not as good, I don't feel as confident at selling a work as I do at translating a work. And so sometimes I translate the work and think it will find its own way at that point. That said, I did think that I was very excited about this novel.
Is that quite usual for translators from Arabic? I know I've heard Savad Hussein say similar things, because for the sort of more common European languages, publishers read French or Spanish or German. That I don't think there are many publishers who read Arabic who can read the original. So presumably translators from Arabic have to do a lot more legwork.
I think that's the case, that there aren't as many editors or publishers who have access to Arabic, so they're not reading themselves. And there aren't as many scouts who are out there doing the work of searching for the next great book. And so it's translators who are often taking on the role of agents alongside the translation work, and finding a way to sell a book or to sell an idea and make a pitch for it. I think in the translation community, we're all immensely grateful for Arab Lit blog, Marsha Links Quayle, who's doing a lot to highlight current things that are coming out. And of course, we wouldn't be here tonight without the Banipal magazine and Banipal organization, which for the past 25 years has been doing that role. So there are these two organizations that have done much to highlight contemporary Arabic literature. And so on behalf of Arabic translators everywhere, thank you so much.
So it's really translator-led. I mean, translators having agency in that whole process.
I would say so, yes. Which is exciting. It's also, I think, a burden, and it's also a challenge. I have in this past year had the pleasure of a publisher approaching me about a translated work, and that's very rare because there are. I think it's uncommon for publishers to know that here's a book they want to translate. I hope it will start happening more often.
Well, I think thanks to books like this, it's going to open publishers' eyes to the fact that there's some very interesting books out there being published, so let's hope. This is a very harrowing novel to read, and you lived with this for some years, translating it. How did you deal with the sort of mental, emotional, just, that harrowing, did you become inhabited by it? How did you stay sane?
I love that question. It makes me think, actually, of the first book by Nejwa that I translated, called Ya Salam in Arabic, and I translated the title O Salam in English. And it's the intertext for this book. The character that shows up on the streets in Beirut is the anti-hero of O Salam. And when my friend Khalid invited me to read the book and consider translating it, I read the book and thought, my immediate reaction was, no way. I don't want to spend another minute with these characters because they're terrible people doing terrible things. And then he, passed on a chapter from his dissertation about the exploration of violence and the gender dynamics and kind of the deeper levels of what Nejwa is doing and why it's so meaningful. And so that persuaded me to do it. With this book, I think I was maybe better prepared. One more thing I'll say about the other one was that as I started translating it, there was a perverse pleasure, perhaps, in inhabiting some of those characters and trying to find their voice as they say things that I would never say, and do things that are not part of my life. And so translation allows that, much maybe like an actor, where you get to embody another character, which can be difficult, but there's also a certain freedom or discovery that comes with that. In the case of translation, though, you can only do so much in a certain time. I might work at an hour at a given point, and part of that hour is maybe not fully understanding, and it's like wrestling with it. And so it can be very intellectual, which is distancing from the things that are happening and the things that are being described. Later in the process, as you can actually start reading what you've translated as a continuous draft, that's when it starts to regain that power.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you focus on the sort of the nuts and the bolts and the mechanics of translation of the task, and you don't think about what you're actually translating.
That's right.
You read yourself.
And the editing, when you're editing, that's sometimes I don't think I've been moved by anything I've written while translating, but sometimes while I'm editing, after coming back to it, when you have fresh eyes and you have a little distance, you can think, oh, wow, that is...
Did I do that? Right. Can you talk about the specific challenges of translating from the Arabic language? And I'm interested in registers of language. So do the registers, the different registers, and I mean the different voices, colloquial, literary, high literary, do they map easily onto English? What goes on linguistically?
There are, quite a few challenges of translating Arabic. Definitely register. I can't think about this question without mentioning punctuation and syntax, which are so diverse. There's not always a lot of standardization in punctuation, so that can be misleading, not always helpful in understanding a text. And syntax as well can be, it doesn't map directly onto English. And so there's thinking a lot about how to convey the information effectively in English that is conveyed effectively in different orders and with different numbers of words and so on in Arabic. And then how do you identify an author's voice or style and try in some way to be echoing that? That's a big part of the challenge. But the things that you're mentioning as well, there's such diversity of, such linguistic diversity in Arabic with all the different dialects, which is part of why it's so hard and was so hard for me to learn. It's also challenging to write convincing dialogue in the standard literary language. Not hard, I should say, but when translating that into English, if you do a very straightforward translation, it feels much more formal than would be believable in English literary translation. There are some authors that are using more of the dialect in their writing. I translated one, the project I did after this was Shelish the Iraqi, which is a blog post written by an anonymous Iraqi in 2005 and 2006 living in Baghdad. And the narration was in Modern Standard Arabic. All the dialogue was in Iraqi Arabic, which brought a certain life, a vibrancy, and which really worked for that project. He was, the author was presenting himself as the eyewitness on the ground, seeing what was happening and hearing, and these are the words that he was hearing. In this, I can say that Nejwa, within the realm of Modern Standard Arabic, it is vigorous, it's lively. She does an amazing job of catching that. There was also one point where there's some slang that comes in that she brings in. A funny story that it was a word I could not find in any of the dictionaries. I gave it my best guess, and thank goodness I asked her, what does this mean? Because I totally got it wrong. And the word was, I'm not going to try the Arabic right now because I'll make a mistake, but she had taken the word gigolo, an Arabic version, and then used the mustar of the form to verb. So to act, so how do you translate that into English? And I guess to act as a gigolo, to live my gigolo life, I think was how it turned out in my English version. But
right. So it's really a huge sort of endeavour to find a voice that's going to work in English, but not sound as though the characters are English.
That's right. Yes. And I was hearing, Daisy Rockwell was talking about this when I heard her speak recently, and she
translates from Hindi.
Translates from Hindi and does a lot of partition literature. So, like, how do you create something that doesn't sound like an American? It needs to be understood, but it also needs to be believable as somebody in Pakistan in 1947. And it's the same thing with Arabic. And so I think that's a challenge for translators from all languages.
Yeah, Yeah. You mentioned that you consulted Najwa at one point. How was the author involved, and how much did you consult? And did she want to see the translation? Does she know English? What was the relationship there?
Yes. So Nejwa is fluent in Arabic and French, and she, we converse in English, so I'm sure she reads English. If I write to her in English, she might write back in French or Arabic, and that's always a fun thing, that interlingual, multilingual communication. When I'm working, I tend to spend a lot of time with the text on my own I guess there are so many questions that I have for so long when making a translation. Many of them eventually get figured out by spending more and more time with the text. And so I think in part not wanting to reveal my current state of ignorance, and in part not wanting to take so much of the author's time, I'll wait and be judicious about, as I'm translating, I'm highlighting in the original text things that I have questions about, things that I need to come back to. And many of them will be resolved, but others I'll be making lists, and in those lists I'll prioritize the most important questions and send those first, and then several rounds of sending questions. But I'm very grateful that both that Nejwa trusted me to translate this text, and trusts that I know what I'm doing as a translator, even when I ask questions that might be a little bit silly, or maybe if I had used my dictionary more effectively, could have found the answer to.
Yeah, well, I think that trust was well placed, seeing the results. So are there different editorial practices in Arabic publishing and English language publishing? And how do those impact on the translation? And do you sometimes have to intervene in some way?
That's a very large question. So the difference between editorial practices in English and Arabic, I could say there are different editorial practices even within English as well, and working with different publishers and different editors, knowing, they will have different degrees of intervention or suggestions or changes that they're proposing, and I need to acknowledge and recognize and express my gratitude to Jeremy Davies, who was the editor at And Other Stories that worked with me on this translation. Jeremy really pushed me to think about how, is this language, how is this effective? How are you capturing the descriptions of Beirut, for instance? I think Jeremy probably improved every page of the translation. So I'm grateful, very grateful. One other aspect of this question is that many Arabic novels come to press without having been gotten much editing support. I think in the English language publishing world, books are read multiple times by multiple different editors, and there's developmental editing, there's copy editing, there's proofreading, and I don't know of any publishers in the Arab world that provide that support, and so it's up to an author to do their work on it, and then I think sometimes they'll circulate it with friends who have comments and suggestions, but things go to press that still have possibly some typos, possibly non-standardized punctuation, possibly some redundancies that maybe aren't meant in a literary sense, but
don't help the book.
That could have benefited from engaged readers before publishing. And so I think Nejwa, I should say, is I don't think Nejwa is incredibly careful and precise, and I was very lucky with the shape of this manuscript that came to me. But there have been others where I've worked to do some of the editing process, and either being pushed by the publisher to do that, and then editing a text and bringing it to the author to see if they're comfortable with the decisions that we made. I'm working now on a new book by Mohsana Rumli, and I think there's a level of trust there where I will point out a few of the things that I've done, a sentence that I've taken out here or there, or a paragraph that I've moved from one chapter to another. But there's such a trust in that relationship that I'm very grateful for.
Thank you. Do we have time for another reading, or do we need to move on to the Q&A? Okay. Okay, so we'll finish with a reading, and then there's going to be a Q&A if you have any questions for Luke.
There are so many that I could choose from. I had a few selected to pick out, but let me do one at the end of the first part. The book is in 3 parts, and I mentioned that it's a book about pain and sadness, and part of that comes from, in Mr. N's case, original wounds in the family, and it's captured in a beautiful way here. We all have a spot on our backs that is vulnerable to loss, where love and security can leak out. They're square, these areas, the size of a hand, cut into the middle of that smooth, flat surface on our body, where all our nerves, all our feelings, all our longings are exposed. A secret panel that grants entrance to the heart for reassurance or its absence to spread within. When we are born, and our first sob makes us realize that we have entered this vale of tears, the doctor lays us on our mother's breast for her to press the palm of her hand onto that spot. That's how the heart is unsealed, how the lungs begin working. Oxygen comes in, our organs throb with life. But when a mother doesn't put her hand on that secret spot on her child's back to rub and massage and caress, the baby isn't let off the hook, no. Life itself steps in to keep its pulse moving, like those machines we plug our hopeless cases into, so as to prevent them from leaving this world too soon. And the child becomes just another digit in life's tally, without an identity or a family of its own. Me? You've probably guessed that no mother pressed her hand onto that special spot on my back. She neither kissed nor nursed me. She suffered me to live in her vicinity, that's all. Perhaps my father took an interest in me, insomuch as fatherhood allows, but a father's hand is not the lifeline that can save the little creature who's been floating inside his mother's belly for 9 months. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we have our speaker, our prize-winning translator, and we have the chair of the judging panel with us, and they will be happy to take questions from you. So if you have any questions, please ask them. And there is a microphone, right? Sunil is in charge of the microphone. So Jonathan, and maybe we'll start with someone behind first. Yeah. Thank you.
A question for Khalid Matawa. In your fascinating lecture, you invoked the Enlightenment several times, and you also mentioned Eros. Now, one of the European thinkers who spoke about Eros in its Dionysus manifestation was Friedrich Nietzsche. Indeed, one of his last letters before he went mad, he signed himself as Dionysus. But Nietzsche, of course, was upholding aristocratic, anti-egalitarian values, whereas you several times mention equality and similar enlightened values. Do you have any comments to make on that?
Well, I mean, I also mentioned that there has been exceptions, and the Enlightenment project. I'm not a historian, and I'm doing things in a wide brushstrokes, but the Enlightenment project, if you keep going with it, it ended in the Holocaust. If you keep the ideas of scientific research and so on, eugenics was supposed to be science. Phrenology was some kind of science. So one of the quick questions, and I mentioned Thomas Jefferson. I mean, he was very much an Enlightenment figure, and in the description of the state of Virginia, he's trying to figure out ways in which he can make justify slavery based on the bodies of black people. So maybe I should stress the sort of intrinsic disequilibrium in the Enlightenment, but the values of equality as such maybe even have emerged from the notion of the noble savages, that was the discovery that people are equal, and even people who live in very so-called primitive society are even better or equal, or the equal of everyone else. And so so I can stress that point more, but but I recognize that, of course, and I hope that it's clear in the essay, maybe when it's read rather than when it's heard. But no, it's exactly there that the promise of equilibrialism was maybe highly Eurocentric and not inclusive of other people, but it's what the world after World War II sort of picked up on, the same values but enhanced, and basically sort of that was Enlightenment 2.0, if you will. Does that answer your question?
No, really, but it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Good of you.
Thanks.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yes, my question is addressed to Khaled. I very much enjoyed your lecture. I noticed that on a couple of occasions you referred to the concept of pure language, which kind of alarmed me to some extent because it sounded a bit Platonic. And I wondered if you could expand for us on what exactly you were thinking of when you talked about pure language.
I'm using the Walter Benjamin expression. Pure language is something that can never come into being. It is the expression, it's when two languages sort of collide, and between their discrepancies and their differences, something more beautiful and unrealizable occurs. So it's not, I mean, Benjamin doesn't say we should all purify our translations to become pure, or that literature is necessarily pure, but there is something that's hoped for, almost like in the state before the Tower of Babel, that one can encounter in having two things sort of rub against each other. Let's say something that's so beautiful in Arabic that you cannot render in English as beautiful, or a translation into English that maybe exceeds or excels on the original, is a suggestion that language has a higher standard that we just cannot get to. And that's where pure language exists. So it's in the task of the translator.
So it is Platonic, in effect.
Yeah, I would say.
Almost Hegelian, perhaps.
Yes, yes.
Okay, anybody questions? Ahmed.
Thank you very much. My question is to Luke. If you can let us into the black box of the translator here and the process of translation. When did you feel the need to domesticate and to foreignize the text? In which areas have you encountered this, the dilemma or dichotomy in your work?
This is a question for Luke.
For Luke, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, so on this dichotomy of domesticization and foreignization, I think that I'm largely writing for, aiming as though this book were written in English. So that's producing something that engages and doesn't, set people or catch them or make them stumble on language or elements coming from the Arabic. I think instead of doing that linguistically, it's, I think, with using the power of the story and the characters and the voices that bring, that allow us to see inside other people, other cultures. So I think that's my general approach.
Yes, please.
This is a question for Roz. I wanted to know how you judge a translation when you don't know the original language and how it works, what goes on in your head.
Tell us more about the judging process.
Yes, it's a good question. So there were 4 judges, 2 who know Arabic and 2 who don't. And so the judges who know Arabic read the books in Arabic and in English, and the ones who didn't know Arabic read them just in English. And we all made our own shortlists, and then we came together and compared our shortlists. And there was the most extraordinary convergence. The Arabic speakers were able to enlighten the non-Arabic speakers on a couple of the titles where they were able to say, well, no, there was a big problem with this one because there was a mistake in the title or something like that. But on the whole, we were very much in agreement, which was a revelation, really, and it's a testimony to the quality of the translation. And you're looking at a good translation of a good book. There could be a very good translation of a not so good book. There could be a bad translation of a good book. But somehow it sort of bubbles to the surface, and we were all absolutely unanimous about this title. Would you agree, Sarah?
Absolutely, 100%. Great. Can I follow up with? Okay, go. Sorry.
Sorry, I said we were all in agreement about the shortlist, and then we were more or less in agreement that. I think you can hear me. Yeah, in agreement.
For the recording.
Oh, right. Sorry. Okay. No. As Ross said, we were all in agreement about the shortlist. And then it was more or less, so we looked at each other and it's Mr. N, isn't it? Yes, I think so too, don't you? Yeah, Mr. N. Yeah, there isn't anything better than that, really. No, it's all magnificent. Yeah, great, and you think so too. Wonderful, let's all do that. Right? I mean, that was more or less how it, with some very small, variations, because the shortlist really was brilliant. But as you said, bubbles to the surface.
So we were deprived of the sort of great arguments that people
didn't
imagine.
have any controversy.
No, not at all.
Can I follow up with the question, and we'll come to you in a second. What about the nomination process? Who nominated the entries, or
the publishers submit.
Does the publisher submit? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think Banipal called in a couple. Is that right, Margaret? That you identified a couple that hadn't. Yeah. But it's the publishers who submit.
Okay. All right. So here we are.
I have a question to Khalid, and a quick question to Khalid, and a quick question to Luke as well. So I'll say them together, and then you can replay. For the question for Khalid, do you think that fidelity in translation demands or should be defined differently from any other fidelity, like as a space as a space that needs a skill, is not only fidelity that I'm preserving things or keeping things in as it should, but also it needs much skill and effort. Like, what's the difference between the fidelity in translation and the definition of fidelity itself? And for Luke, it's similar to the question of the visiting the places that you were describing. What do you do with the traditions, the different culture and fictional of imaginations that you can, if you translate things from Arabic or the opposite, you will find things actually that are imagined differently, and there are expressions that are not culturally the same, and you have to put much work and actually to assimilate the differences. It needs like a big effort. And how do you deal with this in the translation? Thank you.
Khalid?
Yes, I was trying to think. I think in the 19th century, maybe earlier, the idea was that the best way to translate poetry was in couplets, rhymed couplets. That was thought to be maybe the best, truthful way of fidelity, in a sense, is to render, Alexander Pope, to render things in rhymed couplets. Of course, that's not going to be, render things in a more literal way. But the idea that to be true to poetry, you need to make it more of what current poetry or the best kind of poetry being produced in the language sounds like. So the answer is fidelity has meant many things, and it is a cultural element as well as an aesthetic one. I would say that with prose translations emerging later on of Oriental texts, of poetry, there emerged, I mean, that's maybe, some people say that that's like the beginning of free verse in English and elsewhere, because one could get, and Ibn Khaldun talks about that, one can get a substance of poetry without it necessarily being poetry. And in a sense, that has more fidelity in it than not. And so, which is, prose is not poetry in that. So fidelity has many things. It is as vague and noble as maybe pure language, but it also is something that we can decide upon as we practice. You could, there are two maybe sort of layers of it. Sometimes there were lots of translations of Arabic in journals of Arabic literature, the referee journals and so on. And those were, supposed to be more approximate to the so-called literal translation. As you try to make your way into the poetry of a given language as it is practiced in that language, the literal translations tend to not be as welcomed. First, nobody wants to read poetry with footnotes. Footnotes in a poem can add a lot of truth and fidelity to it, but nobody wants to do that in English or in any other language. So it is open, and it is almost like a register of translation. At which level do you translate and sort of have everything in the poem as it is? Or to what way are you providing something that's more like what have been called a trot, where it is more literal with footnotes and so on, where there's and with sometimes those translations are for people who know Arabic to some degree. So it is open. I would say one of the most successful translators who've managed to do both in terms of Arabic poetry and Jahili poetry is Michael Sells, who has produced in a book called Desert Tracings, excellent renditions of Jahili poetry with minimal footnotes, but also with some inventions to English in order to accommodate the Jahili Arabic of the time. So it is open, but maybe letting your readers know your approach and what your methodology is the best way to be truthful in every aspect of the process is fidelity. And it's not the same as within a relationship. A few months ago, my wife bought me a great poster of a film that she thought I liked until now. And I couldn't say, why did you buy me this? But in the end, she could see in my face that I didn't want this poster really, but I had to say thank you. So which fidelity is better, to your feelings or to the expression of appreciation and love? I was caught in the middle red-handed.
Luke?
Thank you for that question. So the question of all of the differences of cultural differences and challenges of interpretation, things that are being expressed in Arabic that might not have equivalences in English, things in Arabic that I might not understand. How do you bridge those gaps? I'll start by saying that recognizing my imperfections is an important part of the process. If I waited until I were perfect to translate and knew everything, I would never translate. And the same with any other endeavor in life. So finding a way to trust that you've gone enough, that you understand enough, and then adding your contribution to the conversation and continually learning together is something that I try to pursue in life. But there are amazing tools, such as the internet is a godsend. Being able to, when I'm seeing something that I'm not understanding, that's the best part. When I know I don't understand it, the real danger is when I think I understand it and I haven't. So I don't go back to dig deeper. But searching a phrase in Google will bring up things, and often Google Images is very helpful. Another great source is a native speaker, somebody who knows more. The project after this one that I mentioned, Shelish the Iraqi, with all of the Iraqi dialect. I believe I read the entire thing with my friend Yusuf Hanna, an Iraqi who's studying to be a doctor. And I was reading my English, and he was following along in the Arabic, and or explaining some things that I just had no idea about. But again, one of the wonderful things about translation is it is such a wonderful way to continue learning about a culture that I've invested so much in, and a language that means so much.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, times when there are words that are not like, are there words that are in Arabic that you kept the same?
So keeping Arabic words, that is
something like imam.
Yeah, well, things that would be in an English dictionary, that's not a problem. And I think if something is in, so if it's in an English dictionary or if it's in Google, if it's easy to find, I don't often feel the need to translate it. If it has a Wikipedia article, I'll try to use that spelling. But in terms of other, I mentioned Daisy Rockwell a minute ago, and I recently read Tomb of Sand, and that has a lot of the Hindi, Urdu, and Sanskrit preserved in the English, and she does it in an amazing way that both speaks to people from those cultures who speak those languages, and then also train the English reader or the reader of the English version and educate us on the book. And I'm not thinking of examples where I've done that in my own books, but it's amazing when a translator can do that.
Slang. I mean, do you preserve the slang in the language, or do you replace the slang from one language to another? That's probably usually doesn't work.
It usually doesn't work, because the slang in English has such specific cultural references that would distract the reader or bring their mind to the wrong place. And so it's, I think in every context, it depends, and it's always a struggle.
Yeah. Okay, Ross.
Coming in on this, one of the things I find interesting is that as a translator into English, there are lots of different Englishes. People write books in different Englishes. There's American English, there's Australian English, there's Indian English, which are as foreign to us as Arabic or something else. There are whole cultures, foods, etc. Books that are written in English, nobody worries about the fact that this is an Australian flower or an American dish. We don't worry about other Englishes, but we get very worried about translations from other cultures. And I think, we shouldn't underestimate readers.
Yeah. I think probably this is all the time we have. Right, so there is a lot to talk about, and I actually had questions for both of you, but I'm going to hold them back until later. So thank you very much for coming. I think we can stop here because the books are waiting and the reception is waiting, and we can chat there and catch up there. So can I invite Nana to come forward so we can very quickly here just say our thank you.
Okay. So I will be very brief. My name is Nana Saif. I'm the chair of Center for...
You have to go up. Turn it on. You have to turn it on. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm used to only karaoke. So but I don't sing today, don't worry. So thank you very much for coming to this event, and we are so glad to see these passionate audience. And thank you very much for wonderful lecture and your reading. And I'm looking forward to reading your translation. And I hope that you are going to accept our invitation to talk in front of our students in the near future. And so thank you very much, everybody. And I will...
Yes,
yeah.
So Dr. Kea Anjaria, who chairs the Center for Cultural, Literary, and Postcolonial Studies, is unwell. She cannot be here, so I say a word of thank you, but also for myself, I'm very honored that Banipal Trust is here at SOAS today. And throughout the proceedings today, we're reminded of the victims of violence in the Middle East, in the Arab world, even as we celebrate translations of Arab authors. So thank you again for reminding us of the Palestinians, of the Libyans, of the Lebanese, of the Iraqis, of the Syrians, and Yemenis, and Arabs all around the world. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the reception, and particularly enjoy the books that are on display before your eyes. Thank you again.
Well, I'm down to say thank you as well, but really it's already been said, but simply on behalf of the Trust, thank you very much for everybody for coming. Thank you for watching on Zoom, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you.